Look at this scar. Go ahead, look at it closely. I don't hide it anymore. This mark was burned into my skin with a hot branding iron by Colonel Marcos Delgado. And before you feel sorry for me, before you see me as a victim, I need you to understand something very clearly. This scar became the evidence that put him behind bars for life. This mark he thought would be his signature of ownership over me became the proof that destroyed him completely. And the story I'm about to tell you over the next hour is not about what he did to me. It's about what I did to him. How? I took every single moment of torture, every rape, every humiliation, and I weaponized it. I turned my pain into a systematic campaign that dismantled his entire life piece by piece until he lost everything. His rank, his freedom, his reputation, his family, everything. And now he sits in a prison cell for the rest of his miserable life, while I stand here free, and I'm going to tell you exactly how I made that happen. But I have to start at the beginning because you need to understand who I was before he tried to break me. I was 28 years old, working as an investigative journalist in a country that was drowning under military dictatorship in the 1980s, one of those Latin American regimes where people disappeared in the night and nobody asked questions because asking questions got you disappeared too. I worked for a small independent newspaper that operated in the shadows. We published stories about the things the government didn't want anyone to know: the torture centers, the mass graves, the systematic elimination of anyone who dared to speak against them. My mother would cry every time I left the house because she knew what I was doing was dangerous. My father, who'd been a political prisoner himself, understood why I couldn't stop. My younger sister, Sophia, thought I was crazy for risking my life when I could have just kept my head down and lived quietly. But I wasn't built that way. I had this burning need to expose the truth no matter what it cost me, and it cost me everything. I had a boyfriend named Daniel. We'd been together 6 months, and for the first time in my life, I was thinking about normal things like marriage and children and a future that didn't revolve around danger. He was an architect who designed schools, and he'd talk about building things while I spent my days documenting destruction. We were talking about moving in together, getting a small apartment with a balcony where we could have coffee in the mornings, maybe adopting a dog. All these ordinary, beautiful dreams that normal couples have when they're falling in love and don't realize how quickly everything can be ripped away. My days were meticulous and paranoid in equal measure because they had to be. I'd wake up at 5 every morning, drink coffee that could strip paint off walls, review my coded notes where every source had a number instead of a name. Every location was referenced by landmarks only I would understand. Because if they ever raided my apartment, I couldn't let them find anything that would compromise the people who trusted me with their stories and their lives. I'd spend my days meeting contacts in different locations, always watching to see if I was being followed, always aware that one wrong move could mean death, or worse than death. And I'd built this network over 3 years of sources inside the military, government workers who were disgusted by what they saw happening. Even a few officials who passed me documents because their conscience finally wouldn't let them stay silent anymore. I was good at what I did, really good. My stories were being picked up by international news agencies. Human rights organizations were using my research in their reports. And that made me dangerous. That made me a target that powerful people wanted eliminated. The phone call that changed everything came on a Tuesday in March. It was raining so hard the streets were flooding. And this woman's voice on the other end was shaking so badly I could barely understand her. She told me she had information about a secret torture facility being run personally by Colonel Marcos Delgado at a farm compound outside the city. She gave me names of people who'd been taken there and never came back. Dates. Specific details about torture methods. Things she couldn't possibly know unless she'd been there or known someone who had. And my heart was racing because this was it. This was the story that could crack everything open, the kind of evidence that could bring international pressure that even the regime couldn't ignore. I spent 3 weeks planning the investigation with obsessive detail. I falsified credentials. I found a maintenance worker at the nearby military base who agreed to help me. Because his own brother had disappeared, I studied patrol patterns and guard rotations. I photographed documents from 3 different sources that confirmed the location and the operation. I recorded conversations on cassette tapes that I hid in hollowed-out books and cigarette packages. Every night I'd come home exhausted from the adrenaline and fear and Daniel would hold me and ask if I was okay, and I'd lie because I couldn't tell him what I was really doing. I couldn't pull him into the darkness that surrounded me. The mistake that destroyed my life was trusting another journalist named Roberto. We'd collaborated on smaller stories before, and I thought we were on the same side. I thought we both wanted to expose the truth. So I told him about the investigation. Not everything, but enough. I wanted his advice on how to protect my sources while still making the evidence undeniable. What I didn't know was that Roberto's daughter had been threatened. Men had approached her outside her school and told Roberto that if he didn't start cooperating, his little girl would disappear. So he'd made a deal to save his family. He'd feed information about troublesome journalists to the security forces, and I was the biggest prize he could offer them. They came for me at 3:15 in the morning. I remember looking at the clock right before the banging started on my door. Not knocking, banging, the sound that means your life is over. They broke the door down within seconds. 6 men in black uniforms with covered faces. They dragged me out of bed. I was only wearing a nightgown, and they didn't let me get dressed or put on shoes. They just hauled me into the street while my neighbor's doors stayed closed because everyone knew better than to interfere. I saw my mother's face at a window across the street, and she was screaming my name. I saw Sophia watching with absolute terror in her eyes, and I remember thinking this might be the last time they ever see me alive. This might be the last memory they have, me being dragged away like an animal in the middle of the night. They threw me in an unmarked van with no windows, my hands zip-tied so tight behind my back I lost feeling in my fingers. We drove for maybe an hour over rough roads. Every bump sent me sliding across the metal floor. And when we finally stopped and they pulled me out, I realized we were at some kind of farm compound. Buildings that looked like they'd been agricultural once, but had been converted into something much darker. And the smell hit me immediately, even from outside. That mixture of human waste and fear, and old blood that you never forget once you've smelled it. They dragged me inside where it was cold and damp, and I could hear sounds from deeper in the building, moaning and crying, and worse than that, the silence that comes after someone has screamed so much they have no voice left. They threw me in a concrete cell about 8 feet square with walls sweating moisture. There was a hole in the corner for a toilet, no bed. No blanket, just concrete floor and darkness, complete absolute darkness when they slam the door. The kind of darkness where your eyes keep trying to adjust, but there's nothing to see. You start to lose all sense of space. You don't know if you're standing or sitting, if the walls are close or far. You start to question your own existence, and they left me there for 3 days. At least I think it was 3 days. I lost all sense of time. Twice a day, they'd shove a cup of water and stale bread through a slot in the door, and I'd eat it even though I wanted to refuse, because survival instinct is stronger than pride. I'd talk to myself just to hear a human voice, recite poetry I'd memorized as a child, count to 1,000 and start over, anything to keep my mind from fracturing completely in that darkness. I'd sleep in short bursts on the freezing floor and wake up not knowing if I'd been asleep for minutes or hours. And that isolation, that sensory deprivation, it breaks something in you before they ever lay a hand on you. It makes you desperate for any human contact, even if that contact is going to hurt you. And that's exactly what they want. On the 4th day they came for me. The door opened and light flooded in so bright it was painful. Hands grabbed me and dragged me down a corridor into a room with a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. There was a metal chair bolted to the floor, and they shoved me into it, zip-tied my wrists to the arms and my ankles to the legs, so I was completely immobilized. And then I waited, shivering in my nightgown in that freezing room with water dripping somewhere in the corner. And that's when Colonel Marcos Delgado walked in for the first time. I'd seen photos of him during my research. I knew he was high-ranking military intelligence, mid-50s, reputation for ruthless efficiency. But seeing him in person was different. He walked in wearing his dress uniform, perfectly pressed, every metal polished, graying hair combed back with precision. And what struck me most was how utterly calm he was, like this was just another day at the office. He pulled up a chair and sat across from me, crossed his legs, folded his hands like we were about to have tea. And when he spoke, his voice was quiet, almost gentle, which somehow made it more terrifying because you could hear the violence underneath the politeness. He said, "I know who you are. I've been reading your work. You're quite talented. It's a shame you've wasted that talent on lies and propaganda." And I told him to go fuck himself, which was probably stupid, but I wasn't going to sit there and let him condescend to me. And he just smiled this cold, small smile and said, we'll see how long that defiance lasts. He asked me questions for hours. Who were my sources? What documents did I have? Who was I working with? Where had I hidden copies of my research? And I refused to answer. I kept demanding a lawyer, demanding to contact my family, demanding to know what charges I was being held under, as if any of that mattered in a place where law didn't exist. When he realized I wasn't going to cooperate, he stood up, adjusted his uniform, and nodded to someone behind me, and I felt hands attaching wires to my body, to my fingers, to my temples, and I knew what was coming right before the first shock hit, and it was worse than anything I could have imagined, electricity shooting through every nerve, every muscle contracting at once. Your teeth clamp down so hard you think they'll shatter. It feels like you're being torn apart from the inside. And when it stopped, I couldn't breathe for several seconds. I just gasped like a drowning person. He asked the same questions. I refused. He nodded and the shock came again, longer this time. I think I screamed, but I'm not sure. Everything went white, and this pattern continued for hours. Shock, questions, refusal, shock, over and over until I literally couldn't form words anymore, until I was sobbing and shaking uncontrollably, until every part of me wanted to tell him anything just to make it stop. But some core part of me knew that if I gave up my sources, they would die, that he would have them arrested and tortured and killed. So I kept my mouth shut even as my body convulsed and betrayed me with each new wave of electricity. They dragged me back to my cell and I collapsed on the floor. Every muscle felt like it had been beaten with hammers. My skin burned where the electrodes had been. I couldn't stop shaking for hours, and that was just the first session. There would be many more. Over the following weeks, they tried every method in their arsenal. Electric shocks became routine. They did waterboarding where they'd strap me to a tilted board and pour water over my face until I was absolutely convinced I was drowning. That sensation of not being able to breathe while water floods your nose and throat and your lungs are screaming for air and your brain is certain you're dying. They let me recover just enough and then do it again. They made me stand in stress positions for hours with my arms extended and shackled to the wall, every muscle burning and screaming. If I dropped my arms even slightly, they'd beat me. They did sleep deprivation with strobe lights and deafening noise pumped into my cell 24 hours straight. I started hallucinating, seeing things that weren't there, hearing voices, losing track of what was real and what was my mind fracturing. They alternated between freezing me in that cell and moving me to a room that was like an oven, shocking my body over and over, breaking me down physically and mentally bit by bit. But Colonel Delgado, he had a particular kind of sadism that went beyond physical torture. He wanted to break me psychologically, to take away not just information, but my sense of self, my dignity, my humanity. And that's when the sexual violence started, maybe 2 weeks into my captivity. I'm going to tell you this part because it's crucial to understand the full scope of what he did and why my revenge was so necessary, even though it's the hardest thing to talk about even now after all these years. He would come to my cell late at night. He'd have guards hold me down and he would rape me while talking in that same calm, quiet voice, telling me I was nothing, that nobody was coming to save me, that I belonged to him now, that he could do whatever he wanted with my body and there was nobody who could stop him. The rape wasn't about sex or desire. I need you to understand that it was about power, about control, about systematically stripping away every shred of autonomy until there was nothing left but fear and submission. He wanted me to feel utterly powerless, to internalize that my body wasn't even my own anymore, that I existed only at his mercy, and there were moments when it worked, when I felt so completely broken that I couldn't remember who I'd been before, when I started to believe that. Maybe this was just my life now, torture and rape and darkness forever, that I'd never escape, that I'd die in that place and nobody would ever know what happened to me. And then came the day he decided to mark me permanently. He walked into the interrogation room with a branding iron, the kind used to mark cattle. It had been heated until it glowed red. And he told me very calmly that since I was being so stubborn, since I refused to cooperate, he was going to give me something to remember him by, something I'd carry for the rest of my life, however long or short that might be. They strapped me down to the metal table. I was screaming before he even touched me because I could feel the heat radiating off that iron. I could smell the metal heating, and when he pressed it against my skin, the pain was beyond description. It was like every nerve ending in my body exploded simultaneously. The smell of my own flesh burning, the sound of it sizzling like meat on a grill. I think I passed out from the pain, but they threw water on me to wake me up, so I'd feel every second of it. He held that burning iron against my skin, pressing hard, making sure it would scar deep, making sure the mark would be permanent and clear. And when he finally pulled it away, he leaned down close to my face and said, "Now you'll carry my signature forever. You'll look at this mark every single day and remember who owns your pain. You'll never be free of me." And in that moment, I believed him. I believed I would carry his brand like an animal. Proof of his ownership. Proof that I was his property. To do with as he pleased. The weeks after that were the darkest period of my entire life. I'd lost so much weight, I was skeletal. I had infections that weren't being treated. My hair was falling out in clumps from stress and malnutrition. I had nightmares in the few minutes when I managed to sleep. And worst of all, I could feel my mind cracking, breaking in ways I wasn't sure could be fixed. There were times I genuinely prayed for death. Times when I thought about ways to kill myself in that cell, even though there was nothing sharp, nothing I could use. I thought about just refusing to eat until I starved, anything to make the pain stop, anything to escape. I was in that facility for 42 days total, though it felt like years. Every day was the same cycle of torture and isolation and terror. And then one day, without any warning, they came to my cell, dragged me out, threw me in a van, and dumped me on the street in front of a hospital, just left me there on the pavement like garbage. I was so weak I couldn't stand. Hospital staff found me and brought me inside. And when I saw myself in a mirror, I didn't recognize the person staring back. I'd lost nearly 50 pounds. My face was hollow and covered in fading bruises. My arms were scarred, and there on my skin was that brand, that mark he'd burned into me, Colonel Delgado's signature like he'd promised. And I just stared at it and started laughing. Hysterical laughing that turned into sobbing. The nurses thought I'd lost my mind, and maybe I had. My family came as soon as they were notified. My mother collapsed when she saw me, literally fell to her knees crying. My father tried to stay strong, but tears ran down his face. Sophia held my hand, so tight it hurt, but I didn't tell her to stop because it was the first gentle touch I'd felt in so long. Daniel came too, but I couldn't look at him, couldn't let him touch me. Every time he tried to get close, I'd flinch away involuntarily. The thought of any man's hands on me after what had happened made my skin crawl, and I could see in his eyes that he knew something had been done to me that changed everything. Within a few weeks, he stopped visiting. He said he'd wait as long as I needed, but we both knew it was over. Whatever we'd had was destroyed in that torture facility. The months after my release were a different kind of nightmare. I was diagnosed with severe PTSD and major depression. I had panic attacks multiple times every day, sometimes triggered by obvious things like sudden noises or men in uniforms, sometimes by nothing at all. I'd just be sitting there and suddenly my heart would race and I couldn't breathe, and I was back in that cell, back on that table with the smell of my burning flesh. I couldn't sleep more than an hour before nightmares woke me. Screaming, I couldn't be touched without having a complete breakdown, which meant no hugs, no comfort, nothing. I was trapped in my own body that felt like it had betrayed me. I started having serious suicidal thoughts. I'd look at bottles of pills and think how easy it would be to take all of them and just go to sleep forever and never have to feel this crushing weight again. The only thing that stopped me was knowing it would destroy my mother, who'd already suffered so much. I went to therapy, took medication, spent time in a psychiatric hospital when the suicidal thoughts got too intense, and slowly, painfully slowly, I started to piece myself back together. But I was building a different person. I couldn't be who I was before. That woman died in that torture facility. I had to figure out who this new scarred, broken, traumatized version of me was going to be. And through all of this, through every therapy session and every sleepless night and every panic attack, there was one thought circling in my mind like poison. Colonel Marcos Delgado was still free. He was still in command, still walking around in his perfect uniform with his medals, still torturing other people, still living his life with complete impunity, while I could barely function, while I jumped at shadows, while I carried his mark on my body. And that knowledge ate at me every single day. I'd see news reports mentioning him, and I'd have to turn it off before I smashed the television. The injustice was so overwhelming I felt like I would choke on it. 8 months after my release, I was in a therapy session, still barely functional, when my therapist asked, "What do you want your life to be about now?" And something about that question cut through all the fog in my brain. I looked at her and said without hesitation, I want to destroy him. And for the first time in 8 months, I felt something besides fear and despair. I felt anger, clean and focused and burning hot. Rage that wasn't scattered but concentrated like a laser, and it felt good. It felt like waking up. That session was the turning point. From that day, I had purpose again. I started to see that if I wanted to destroy Colonel Delgado, I couldn't do it with violence. I couldn't shoot him or stab him. That would just get me arrested or killed. I had to destroy him systematically the way he tried to destroy me, taking apart every piece of his life until there was nothing left, and that meant I needed evidence. Irrefutable, undeniable evidence that would convince courts and international tribunals that this man was a monster who needed to be locked away forever. I started by documenting my own story with meticulous detail. Every torture session I could remember, every rape, every moment of degradation. I wrote it all down, no matter how painful it was to relive. I recorded myself on video telling the story, showing my scars, showing that brand he burned into me. I took medical photographs, got statements from doctors describing my injuries. When I was released, I was building a case file that was comprehensive and undeniable. Then I started looking for other survivors because I knew I wasn't his first victim and I wouldn't be his last. I reached out through human rights organizations, through connections from my journalist days, and one by one I found them. Other people who'd been through his torture facility, who had their own scars and trauma. At first, many didn't want to talk. They were terrified of retaliation. But I was patient. I showed them my documentation, explained what I was trying to do, and slowly they started to trust me. I collected 17 testimonies total, 17 people willing to go on record about what Colonel Delgado had done, and every story was as bad or worse than mine. People tortured for months, people who lost family members, people bearing scars that would never heal. Together we built this portrait of systematic abuse, of crimes against humanity that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. But testimony alone wouldn't be enough. I needed documents, the kind of proof that bureaucrats and judges couldn't ignore. So I started rebuilding my network of sources, reaching out to contacts who'd gone underground, finding new people inside the military and government who were disgusted by what they saw, and piece by piece I gathered evidence. Records of detentions with no official paperwork, transfer orders showing people moved to that facility, financial documents showing money funneled into unauthorized operations. And then I discovered Colonel Delgado wasn't just a torturer, he was corrupt. He'd been embezzling from military budgets for years. He had offshore accounts in Panama and the Cayman Islands, properties in Miami bought with money that definitely didn't come from his official salary. He had a mistress in an expensive apartment he was paying for. His children were in American universities with tuition his salary couldn't possibly cover. Every piece of his comfortable life was built on stolen money and the suffering of his victims. I spent 2 years doing this work. 2 years of living in fear that he'd discover what I was doing and have me killed. 2 years of slowly, methodically building a case, so comprehensive that it couldn't be ignored. And during that time, I was also healing in my own way. The work gave me purpose. It gave me a reason to get out of bed every morning. It transformed my rage from something destructive into something focused and productive. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was fighting back. When I finally had everything I needed, I coordinated with international journalists from the New York Times, BBC, Der Spiegel, organizations with the reach and protection I needed. I couldn't trust local media, but international press had power the regime couldn't easily suppress. I contacted human rights organizations with my complete dossier, testimonies from 17 survivors, medical records, photographs, financial documents proving corruption, and the most damning piece, security footage from the torture facility itself that I'd managed to obtain through a contact, videos showing systematic torture, including sessions personally conducted by Colonel Delgado. The arrogant fool had kept archives thinking they were safe, thinking they proved his power. I worked with international lawyers to prepare simultaneous lawsuits in multiple jurisdictions, national courts, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, even criminal proceedings in the United States under extraterritorial torture laws, since his properties and family were on American soil. We set a date. Everything would go public the same day. All the articles published simultaneously. All the lawsuits filed at once. All the testimonies released in an international press conference. The coordination had to be perfect. That last week before it all went public was terrifying. I was afraid something would go wrong, that he'd discover the plan and silence me permanently. I'd left the country secretly, stayed in safe houses, had multiple backup copies of everything in different locations. And then the day came. I woke up in a European hotel room and watched as headlines exploded in dozens of languages. Photographs of scars, including that brand, were on newspapers worldwide. The videos started circulating, causing global outrage, and the regime panicked. Within 48 hours, Colonel Delgado was removed from command. Within a week, he was under house arrest. The lawsuits cascaded like dominoes. His assets were frozen. His children were questioned. His mistress testified against him for immunity. Everything he'd built on terror and corruption collapsed, because truth, when documented meticulously and exposed with perfect coordination, is an unstoppable force. The trial was historic. I returned to the country with international protection to testify. The courtroom was packed with journalists and activists and survivors and families of the disappeared. When I walked in, I saw Colonel Delgado for the first time since my torture. He looked smaller somehow without his uniform and power, but his eyes still had that cold calculation. My testimony lasted 2 days. I had to relive every moment of those 42 days in that facility. I showed my scars to the court, including that brand. I looked directly at him and said, "You tried to own my pain, to make me carry your mark as proof of your power. But this scar became my evidence, my proof, the thing that will put you behind bars forever. You didn't sign my destruction, you signed your own." 16 other survivors testified, each story adding layers to the portrait of systematic evil. The documentary evidence was irrefutable. The videos were indefensible. Even some of his own subordinates turned witness for reduced sentences. After 3 months, the verdict came: guilty of crimes against humanity, torture, rape, corruption, embezzlement. Sentence of life in prison without possibility of parole. When the sentence was read, I didn't feel euphoria. I felt something quieter and deeper. Closure. He would never have power over anyone again, never cause pain again. He'd spend the rest of his days in a cell experiencing a fraction of the isolation and powerlessness he'd imposed on hundreds of people. And that brand on my skin that he'd meant as his signature of ownership became the evidence that destroyed him. The ultimate irony. His attempt to mark me permanently became the permanent mark against him. Now, 20 years later, I need you to understand what came after the justice. Destroying Colonel Delgado didn't erase my trauma, didn't remove my scars, didn't give back the years he stole, but it gave me something crucial. It gave me agency. I transformed from victim to survivor, to fighter to victor. This mark on my skin that was supposed to be a symbol of ownership over me became my badge of honor. My proof that I survived the worst one human can do to another and still stood up and fought. Back and won. I channeled everything into creating an organization supporting torture survivors. I work with international courts documenting crimes against humanity. I travel the world speaking about resilience and justice and the power of refusing to let evil win. I found my family and other survivors who understand without explanation. Slowly, I rebuilt my ability to trust and love and feel pleasure without guilt. It took years, decades really, and I'm not cured in any traditional sense. I still have occasional nightmares. There are still touches that make me flinch, still difficult days. But I learned that healing isn't about becoming who you were before. It's about integrating what happened and choosing who you want to become after. My torture thought he could break me permanently. Instead, he forged me into something he could never destroy. I have a life now I never imagined possible in those dark days in that cell. I have work that matters, relationships built on real trust. I have peace that I fought for and earned. If you're listening and you've experienced trauma or violence or abuse, know this: your pain is real. Your scars matter. You're not defined by what was done to you. You're defined by what you choose to do with your survival. The people who hurt you want you to stay broken. They want you to carry their mark as proof of their power over you. But you can take that mark and transform it into proof of your strength, your resilience, your refusal to let them win. This scar is no longer Colonel Delgado's signature. It's mine. It's my testament to survival, to fighting back, to the power of truth and justice and refusing to let evil have the final word. I wear it with pride now because it represents not his power over me, but my power over him. Every day he sits in that prison cell is a day I win. Every day I live my life free and strong and purposeful is a day his attempt to destroy me fails completely. The man who branded me like cattle, who raped me, who tortured me, who tried to take everything from me, including my humanity, that man lost everything. His freedom, his reputation, his family, his legacy. He'll die in prison forgotten, except as a warning about what happens when evil is documented and exposed and fought against with relentless determination. And I'll live on doing work that matters, helping other survivors, proving every single day that survival is possible, that justice is possible, that transforming pain into purpose is possible. So when you look at the scar, don't see victimhood, see victory. See what's possible when you refuse to let the people who hurt you define your story. See proof that even in the darkest moments when you think you can't survive one more second, there's strength inside you that you haven't discovered yet. Strength that can carry you through torture and trauma and the long, hard road of recovery. Strength that can help you not just survive, but fight back and win and build a life that matters. Colonel Marcos Delgado tried to destroy me, and instead I destroyed him. That's not revenge. That's justice. That's taking back your power. That's surviving and thriving and living proof that evil doesn't get to win. This is my story of how I took the worst thing that ever happened to me and turned it into the catalyst for the best thing I ever did. Destroying the monster who thought he owned me and building a life dedicated to making sure other monsters face justice too. This scar is my signature now. My mark on the world that says I survived, I fought, I won. And I'm still here, stronger than ever, free in ways he'll never be again. And that is how you turn pain into power.